Hello everyone. In today's video, we are discussing about the regulation of respiration or control of respiration. If you closely look at the respiratory process, it does have two important components. That is, the respiration has an involuntary component, that is, without our consciousness, the respiration goes on. However, it can also have an voluntary component. That is, we can hold a breath, or we can take more amount of air inside, or we can expire out forcefully with the conscious effort. However, it should be noted that it is not for a longer period of time. It is always taken over by the involuntary component of the respiratory process. The regulation of respiration is most important because it sees that there is optimum gas exchange that occurs and the cell gets a good amount of oxygen and it eliminates carbon dioxide. Ultimately, the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide is maintained, thus the partial pressure of oxygen and the carbon dioxide, and also the pH inside the body. Therefore, it sees that the normal functioning of the cell goes on. The overall mechanisms can be classified as either the neural mechanisms that are involved, that is, the nervous system plays an important role here in the regulation of respiration, or the humoral mechanisms. Humoral mechanisms involves the different components that are dissolved in the blood or in the fluids, which are detected by some of the special receptors. Then it is taken to the higher centers where the regulation of respiration is seen. If you look at the components or the structures that are involved in the control of respiration, we do have the control centers that are present in the body. We have the chemoreceptors, the mechanoreceptors, and also the other types of receptors like thermoreceptors, pain receptors, or even the proprioceptors. All helps in regulation of respiration. We will see one by one. Coming for the control centers. The control centers are present in the central nervous system, especially they are present in brainstem. So they are present in two areas, that is in the medulla and in the pons. Therefore, they are also referred to as medullary control centers and pontine control centers. So, in the medullary respiratory control centers, we do have two important neurons that are emerging out. One is called dorsal respiratory group neurons, referred to as DRG, and we do have ventral respiratory group neurons, VRG. So these are the two important neurons that emerges out from the medulla, which helps in the regulation of respiration. From the pontine or from the pons, we again have two important areas. One is the pneumotaxic center and apneustic center. Pneumotaxic center is present in the upper pons. Apneustic center is present in the lower pons. Secondly, we do have the chemoreceptors. Again, the chemoreceptors can be classified as the central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. The central chemoreceptors and the one which are present in the central nervous system, they are present near to the area of the higher control centers, like they are present near the medullary control centers and the pontine control centers. Whereas the peripheral chemoreceptors are present in carotid bodies and aortic bodies. These chemoreceptors are important in detecting the changes in the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and also the pH or hydrogen ion concentrations. Whereas these two plays a different role, we will see it in detail later on. Mechanoreceptors, importantly, they involve the stretch receptors that are present in the airways of the respiratory apparatus. It is also present in lung parenchyma. There are something called juxta capillary receptors. They are also present in the lung parenchyma, or some of the irritant receptors. They are present all over the respiratory apparatus. We also have the involvement of thermoreceptors, which actually detect the change in the temperature. Even the pain receptors can also modify the respiratory rate, and most importantly, the proprioceptors, the receptors which will detect the position of your body, also has an effect on the regulation of the respiration. Now we will see the control centers of the respiration. So they are present in the central nervous system in the brain stem. So we do have the pons and also the medulla. So in the pons, in the upper pons, we do have the pneumotaxic center, and in the lower pons we do have apneustic center, and in the medulla we do have the dorsal respiratory group neurons and ventral respiratory group neurons. So coming for the dorsal respiratory group of neurons that is present in the medulla, it is also considered as inspiratory center. Because it is from the dorsal respiratory group neurons the action potential is generated, therefore it initiates or triggers the inspiration process. Therefore, this is the one which will control the basic rhythm of the respiration. So the basic rhythm of the respiration is controlled by dorsal respiratory group of neurons. The dorsal respiratory group of neurons gets the sensory input via the chemoreceptors. It also gets the sensory input via mechanoreceptors and also through proprioceptors, through either cranial nerve 9, that is glossopharyngeal, or cranial nerve 10, that is vagus. So from chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors and proprioceptors, you do get a sensory input to the dorsal respiratory group neurons. From the dorsal respiratory group neurons through the phrenic nerve, the motor output is passed. The output is via the phrenic nerve, which will innervate the principal inspiratory muscle, that is the diaphragm. So whenever we get the impulse from the dorsal respiratory group neurons, the diaphragm gets contracted, then the inspiratory process starts. Now coming for the ventral respiratory group neuron, this was also referred to be as expiratory center, but now it is known that the ventral respiratory group neurons are also involved in inspiration and also in expiration. However, the most important point to be remembered is that these are quiet or silent during normal respiratory process, and they are active during heavy exercise, or whenever there is in need of a larger amount of air or the volume of air, they become active. So the impulse, they do also gets the input from these receptors, but the motor output is through the intercostal muscles and also to the abdominal muscles, which play an important role during active exercise where the body needs more amount of oxygen. So we have seen in our previous discussion that if you need a larger amount of air that has to be accumulated, then there should be the involvement of the abdominal muscles or the intercostal extra muscles, so that the body can take extra amount of air. Now coming for the pneumotaxic center. The pneumotaxic center is present in the higher pons. These are involved in turning off or switching off of the inspiratory process, and they start or they trigger expiration. Therefore, they are involved in the regulation of the respiratory volume and also the respiratory rate. Therefore, we can put it as they are involved in fine tuning of the respiration. We do have the apneustic center. Apneustis is an abnormal type of breathing which is characterized by prolonged inspiration followed by a brief period of expiration. That means to say, whenever the apneustic center is active, this will prolongs the inspiration process. Therefore, it plays an important role during the complementary breathing cycle or sigh. These both pneumotaxic center and the apneustic center has got its influence on both DRG and VRG, so that they will regulate the amount of or the rate of respiration or the amount of gas that is taken inside the body. So now we will see how the chemoreceptors helps in the regulation of respiration. So the chemoreceptors can be classified or divided into the central chemoreceptors and the peripheral chemoreceptors. The chemoreceptors are sensitive for the change in the partial pressure of oxygen, carbon dioxide and pH or the hydrogen ion concentration, especially on the arterial side. The central chemoreceptors are present in the brainstem. They are very close to the medullary control centers, and these will detect the change, especially in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. More than 70% of the change is detected by the central chemoreceptors. They are much more sensitive to the carbon dioxide induced hydrogen ion concentration. So what do you mean by it? So whenever there is increased carbon dioxide, which we call it as hypercapnia, that is increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial side, the carbon dioxide can pass the blood-brain barrier. So in the blood, when it crosses the blood-brain barrier, the carbon dioxide goes for the hydration reaction with the water that is present in cerebrospinal fluid, or in the extracellular fluid there. In the cerebrospinal fluid, it forms carbonic acid, which dissociates into the H plus ions and bicarbonate ions. So this production of H plus ions in the cerebrospinal fluid is due to the carbon dioxide that is entering via the blood-brain barrier from the peripheral circulation. So that's why it is called as induced carbon dioxide induced hydrogen production. The central chemoreceptors are much more sensitive to this hydrogen ion concentration. So whenever there is increased carbon dioxide, obviously there is increased hydrogen ion concentration. This will be detected by the central chemoreceptors, and they will send the signal to the respiratory controlling centers, that is the dorsal respiratory group neurons, the pneumotaxic center, and ultimately the aim is they increase the respiratory rate, or they go for hyperventilation, increased inspiration, so that by hyperventilation whatever the amount of carbon dioxide that is there can be eliminated out. For example, in case of decreased carbon dioxide concentration, obviously there will be decreased production of hydrogen ions, which decreases the respiratory rate. So this is most important controlling system. So here there is minute to minute control, so that it is noted that the carbon dioxide is not accumulated inside the body. The carbon dioxide is eliminated out. Secondly, we do have the peripheral chemoreceptors. They are present in carotid bodies and also in the aortic bodies. The carotid bodies are present near the bifurcation of the carotid artery. The aortic bodies are present near the aortic arch. So these consists of type 1 cells and also type 2 cells. Type 1 cells are also called glomus cells. Type 2 cells are also called supporting cells. These type 1 cells are involved in the detection, where it consists of the neurotransmitters like dopamine, ATP, etc. These peripheral receptors, that is your carotid bodies and iotic bodies, are much more sensitive in detection of partial pressure of oxygen, that is especially the arterial partial pressure of the oxygen and also the pH. A very few amount, about 20 or 10% of the change in the carbon dioxide is detected by these peripheral receptors. However, a major portion is detected by central chemoreceptors, and they are sensitive for the decrease in the partial pressure less than 60 mmHg, the partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 mmHg, and they are also sensitive for decreased pH or increased hydrogen ion concentration, which is produced because of the metabolism. It may be the lactic acid or any other acids like ketones, etc. They are produced, they are sensitive for these. So, whenever the partial pressure of the oxygen is decreased to 60 mmHg or there is decreased pH, they send the signal to the respiratory centers, especially the dorsal respiratory group, the pneumotaxic center, via, if it is from the carotid bodies, from the 9th cranial nerve, and if it is from the iotic bodies, it is the 10th cranial nerve. So, they will take the impulses to the respiratory center and there is increased respiration, so that more of oxygen can be inhaled. Here the point to be noted in detecting the change of partial pressure of oxygen is that up to at around 60 mmHg, you can still see about 70 or 80% of the hemoglobin is still saturated with the oxygen. So, this plays an important role whenever the oxygen partial pressure concentration goes less than 60 mmHg. Now, we will see the role of the stretch receptors. The stretch receptors are present in the lung parenchyma, and also they are present in near the smooth muscles of the airways, especially in the bronchioles. So, these respond or they get stimulated whenever the lung is expanded. So, this can be explained by what is called Herring-Burer reflex. There are two separate reflexes that is explained. One is called as inflation reflex and deflation reflex. So, we will see what the Herring-Burer inflation reflex explains. This is important to prevent over distension of the lung. So, the over distension of the lung is prevented by this Herring-Burer inflation reflex. So, whenever there is increased volume of air that is being taken inside, this will be detected by the stretch receptors. That is, whenever the lung expands more, is detected by the stretch receptors, and they send the signal to the respiratory centers via the cranial nerve 10 or the vagus, especially towards the pneumotaxic center, apneustic center, so that the inspiration is inhibited and expiration starts. So this is how it prevents the over distension of the lung. So whenever there is deflation, it can stimulate the respiratory center to take inspiration, to prevent expiration and to trigger the expiration process. The other type of receptors can also have their innervation to the respiratory centers, so that they can either increase the respiration or decrease the respiration, or they can even stop for a very brief period of time. Some of the kind like juxtacapillary receptors, they are present in the lung parenchyma and also in the interstitial spaces. They are very much detect the fluid accumulation in the lungs, and they may cause the reflex apnea. So there are two types of fibers, one is called as J fibers and C fibers from these receptors. There are irritant receptors that are present in the respiratory airway apparatus, which will detect the irritants and it may cause hyperventilation. Even the thermoreceptors, which detect the temperature, can also has an effect on the respiratory center in causing hyperventilation or hypoventilation. Proprioceptors, which will detect the body position, mainly which is present in the muscles and the tendon. So they will give whether the body is in a movement or not, especially during the exercise. So it can give its impulses to the respiratory center, therefore they can go for hyperventilation. Or even the pain receptors, etc., has also their play an important role in giving the signal to the respiratory centers. So to quickly summarize, the overall aim is to maintain the partial pressure of the oxygen in the arterial side at around 100 mmHg, the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide at 40 mmHg, the pH at 7.4, and the bicarbonate ion concentration at 24 milliequivalents per liter. So all these is done by several mechanisms like the respiratory centers that is present in the medulla and the pons, the chemoreceptors that may be present in the central or the periphery, the mechanoreceptors which may be the stretch receptors, the proprioceptors, etc., which will direct to change in the activity of the respiratory muscles so that it can accommodate more volume of air or it can give out the air from the lungs. So whenever there is increased partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, it increases the alveolar ventilation. When it decreases, it decreases. Whenever the pH increases, there is increase in the alveolar ventilation. However, whenever there is increased partial pressure of the oxygen, it decreases the alveolar concentration. Whenever it is decreased, it increases the alveolar ventilation.